O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, the treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us. Cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So, does anybody have any burning questions from last time? Okay. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is basic history, and it's the history of not only Saint Tikhon and the restoration of the Patriarchate, but it's also the history of the Bolshevik coup and how it affected the Russian Orthodox Church, not only in Russia but also in America, because it had a huge effect on the church in America. And basically, after the Bolshevik coup, life in the American church was radically changed. And there are different elements of that. And over the next few weeks, we'll be going over, these various elements of how life in the church changed, of how the structure changed, of how the ministry of the church changed, and also look and see as to how it affected the mission of Orthodoxy in America. Saint Tikhon was called back to Russia in 1907. He was made the Archbishop of Yaroslavl, so he got a promotion. He'd been on hardship duty in America. And so, and there was a very sad thing, I think, certainly for the American flock, but also for him as well, because he'd really become their pastor, their archpastor, and had come to know his people, had come to know the churches, had visited every corner of the continent, and had done tremendous work here. In 1907, Bishop Platon, who you'll will be hearing about a lot over the next few weeks, because he was extremely significant for the development of the church in America, or rather, maybe not its development, but its problems. But he came and was made the ruling hierarch. He had two vicar bishops, one for the Aleuts and Alaska, and another for Brooklyn. Of course, Brooklyn was Bishop, now St. Raphael Hawawini. He had, as head of a mission, the mission to the Greeks, a certain Archimandrite Theoklitos, who was in Galveston. Galveston is a very old church, and particularly the Serbian church down there, but apparently they had a Greek priest. Then in charge of the Serbian mission was Archimandrite Sebastian Dabovich, who was born and raised in San Francisco. He grew up at the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in San Francisco. Of course, when he was a child, it was the diocesan headquarters, and he was the first American born priest to be ordained. Then there was a Father Nathaniel Irvine, who had been an Anglican, and he was the head of the mission for the Americans. Of course, during this whole period, there was a very warm relationship going on between the Anglicans and the Orthodox, and it was it presented quite a pastoral challenge because many of the Anglicans believed that they were already Orthodox, and one of the big problems was they were poaching our parishioners. And telling them, well, they don't really need an Orthodox priest. You know, coming to the Episcopal Church is just fine. And the Orthodox Church literally lost tens of thousands of people to the Episcopalians as a result. Of course, we'd get them back eventually. At that time, the mission had 4 journals. One in Russian, one in Arabic, one in Serbian, and one in English, plus a newspaper for the Carpatho-Rusyns. There were 2 seminaries, one in Minneapolis, or rather in Cleveland, or rather, no, it was, the one in Minneapolis was relocated to Tenafly, New Jersey, so that it could be closer to the diocesan headquarters. And then there was also a seminary in Sitka. There was a monastery, Saint Tikhon's monastery had been established in, I believe, 1904. I believe St. Raphael Hawaini was the one who consecrated the site, but St. Tikhon purchased it personally out of his own pocket. So the bishops were very involved in the establishment of the monastic site there, and the monastery also had an orphanage. There were various schools, and there were something over 100 parishes. In 1909, there was a Bishop Innocent who had been bishop in Alaska, and he was sent back to Russia. And Alexander Nemilovsky was made bishop and made bishop of Alaska. And he's somebody that, he's another name to remember. Also in 1909, the Father Alexis Toth died. And he was buried at Saint Tikhon's monastery in the cemetery there. 1911, the seminary in Minneapolis was transferred to Tenafly, New Jersey. So I was a little off on that. In 1914, Archbishop Platon was transferred back to Russia, to the Diocese of Kishinev. But during his tenure from 1907 to 1914, he'd received 72 parishes, mostly from the Uniates. But it also helped that the Uniate bishop at that time was trying to Ukrainianize the Carpatho-Rusyns. Now, the Carpatho-Rusyns are a very interesting group. It's in Western Ukraine, or it's the far western tip of Ukraine that borders Hungary and Romania, and of course, and a little bit of Poland, I think. It's all valleys and mountains, and the borders kept rolling back and forth as wars and armies and empires went back and forth. And so the people never quite knew who they were, who their bishops were, but they held on to their traditions, and they had held on to them for a very long time, so that there are some traditions among the Carpatho-Rusyns that go back to Constantinople, probably in the year 1000 or 1200. There's some very ancient things that have been maintained over the course of the centuries, which have not been maintained elsewhere. Just liturgically, for example, there's a huge, it looks like a Western Paschal candle, except it's a trident. And that's carried around, it's immersed into waters at baptism. It's immersed into the water of theophany. It has a very specific role in the liturgy. And of course, it's a very great honor for somebody in the parish, usually the president of the parish, like the starosta, to carry that candle during the gospel reading and the liturgy or whatever. And there's other things too that are very, very ancient. With the whole Uniate phenomenon, because they were surrounded by Roman Catholics and on to the west and to the north, and you had all these Uniates in Ukraine. A lot of the Carpatho-Rusyns, as they have today, remained faithful to Moscow. So they retained this a Russian Orthodox identity on one hand, and never blended in. Now, this whole period, the early first, 15, 20 years of the 20th century was a period of growing nationalisms. And there was actually a Carpatho-Russian nationalism. The other country that Carpatho-Russia borders on was Slovakia. And, parts of it were in Slovakia at sometimes, part were in Romania sometimes. Most of it was in Poland at other times. And a lot of it ended up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire until it was annexed to Ukraine eventually. At the beginning of the Soviet period, I think at the same time, I'm not sure exactly, but I think at the same time as Ukraine, about 1918, 1919, was an independent country for 2 years. Carpatho-Russia also tried to be an independent country, but got subsumed into Soviet Ukraine. Anyway, so there's this the people there are very scrappy, and they defend their tradition, they defend their lives, and it was these people that constituted a large number of the immigrants, the Uniate immigrants that entered into the Russian Orthodox Church when the Roman Catholic Church rejected them.
Is it okay to toss in a question?
Sure.
Oh, I was wondering, is it a very bad thing to be a Uniate? I mean, is it like a theological error, or is it more of a community error? I mean, my understanding is they actually use the same creed as the Orthodox. They just get their apostolicity through the Bishop of Rome instead of another bishop. I mean, can you touch on that briefly, or?
Well, the Uniates, I mean, they're not, I mean, they're great people. There's nothing wrong with them as people. But, they're basically Roman Catholics who use Orthodox services. And they'll call themselves Orthodox in communion with Rome. Well, the reality is the Orthodox are not in communion with Rome. We reject, we reject certain elements of Roman Catholicism, and we regard it as heretical, quite frankly. There are other elements of the Uniatism which has subjected them to intense Latinization. So, so the outline of their services may be, traditional, comes from the Orthodox. But then there's also elements that have been inserted over the course of the years, elements of piety, elements that have theological. For example, they would still do First Communion at 7. They would do novenas. They would do all these things. Even their iconography was affected. I remember going into one Greek Catholic church in Pennsylvania, and it had no iconostas, but it had a baldacchino over the altar, and the whole back of the altar wall was covered with icons. But all the icons were bloody. You know, this Western cult of blood and suffering had been transmitted to them, and it's a very, very Western thing. You'd never see anything like that in an Orthodox church. Is it wrong? Not necessarily. But is it our tradition? No. And does it fit with our tradition? No. And so what's happened with the Uniates over the, it started out as because the bishops, the Orthodox bishops, whose dioceses were conquered essentially by Poland and Lithuania, found it politically incorrect to have their allegiance to the Russian Orthodox Church, which was the enemy empire next door. And so they switched their allegiance to the Polish Roman Catholic Church under the terms of the Council of Florence. Well, this created a situation where you had these churches, these Eastern Rite churches, Eastern Rite Roman Catholic churches they were neither fish nor fowl. They were neither Orthodox, nor were they Roman Catholic. The Orthodox didn't know what to do with them, and the Roman Catholics didn't know what to do with them. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and the ecumenical dialogues going on between the Orthodox and the Catholics, and the Uniates are a huge obstacle to dialogue and to any kind of discussion about reunion. So the Roman Catholic Church, you know, because these people are not only under the Roman Catholic Church, they're also kind of rather ultramontane zealots for Roman Catholicism, albeit in the Byzantine Rite, many of them. But the Roman Catholic Church then tells them, go away and become Orthodox. We don't want you, you're an obstacle, you're a problem, we don't know what to do with you, go away. And the Orthodox don't know what to do with them either. So it's a real problem. For example, the Uniates have been forbidden to receive converts. They can baptize children, but they can't receive converts. Basically, the policy of the Roman Catholic Church is that they should die off, which is not exactly very evangelical, shall we say. So the Uniates are caught they're caught between a rock and a hard place. And you know, and they have their own tradition, and a lot of them have moved much more towards their Orthodox roots, but they've still held on to this whole idea of affiliation with the papacy. Then, you know, we'll be talking a lot about this whole issue when we get to talking about the contemporary situation between Moscow and Rome, and between Constantinople and Moscow and Rome, because the Uniates play a huge part in this whole thing, and especially in Ukraine. There are Uniate churches all throughout. There's a kind of a line that goes from the Baltic all the way down to the Mediterranean, of the border between the Orthodox world and the Roman Catholic world. And a lot of that are Uniates. Then they have, actually the Roman Catholic Church has 23 Eastern Rite churches. Eastern Rite, jurisdictions. Quite frankly, I feel very sorry for them. So for example, it's a very interesting thing when Alexis Toth came over to Minneapolis in 1890. He went to what was his legitimate canonical superior, who was the local Roman Catholic bishop, who basically told him to go away. You don't have permission to serve the liturgy. I don't want anything to do with you and your immigrants. Go away. We don't want you. And so they went to the Russian Orthodox Archbishop in San Francisco, and he received them. And so the people, for the most part, felt like they'd come home because they were being warmly received by the Russian Orthodox Church. They could maintain their tradition. They could maintain their, cultural uniqueness. And it was a return to their roots. And that movement continued up through the 30s of not only individual parishes coming into the Russian mission, but then in the 30s, when the whole Russian mission was just in chaos, there was a whole diocese, Uniate, Carpatho-Rusyn diocese, that converted and came under the ecumenical patriarchate. The Carpatho-Rusyn diocese that's there today. There's many, many lovely, faithful people in that, and good priests and, monastics. I know a bunch of them. But this whole issue of the relationship with Rome, and the Orthodox look at that relationship with Rome that the Uniates have had, and we say, we don't want any part of that. Because it meant not only domination, but the injection of all of these foreign elements into the tradition, and therefore the corruption of the tradition in ways that we just don't want anything to do with. But this is one of the dynamics that is part of the whole history of Orthodoxy in America. So, does anybody else have any questions at this point?
Well, just a quick comment. So my dad is Carpatho-Rusyn, grew up in the eastern part of Slovakia, not far from Ukrainian. And his early, memories and early history includes some of the, call it persecution of the Orthodox by the Uniates, and that history, is complicated and painful, but that has had and has a large effect on the memories and relationships.
Oh yeah, and it went both ways, to be honest. There was Orthodox persecution of the Uniates as well, but it usually went the other way because it went the other way whenever you had Western powers occupying Orthodox territory,
right?
And they tried to force the Orthodox into Uniatism. But then when Russia would take over territory with Uniates, the Uniates complained that they were being persecuted by the Russians. But my guess is they were being persecuted by the communists and more than by the church. So.
This is Frank. I had a comment about, I did some reading about the Uniates, the Carpatho-Rusyns and others in the US, and they had a lot of, one of the big issues for the Roman Catholic bishops and archbishops of the Latin tradition was the fact that the Carpatho-Rusyns and others had a married clergy.
Right.
And they wanted to forbid them from having a married clergy in the US. And sometimes they would allow married clergy, someone to marry overseas if he were a priest and come here. But at other points, they didn't even want them they didn't want them functioning at all or visible even in their own parishes.
Right.
And that was a huge issue. It was only recently that Pope Francis lifted that.
Right.
I mean, after all these, centuries, really.
Yeah, it was never a really smooth transition into the Uniates in some quarters. So, and I think, quite frankly, that's this whole experience of seeing how Rome dealt with the Uniates is what colors so much of the Orthodox attitude towards Roman Catholicism. They say, oh, well, we should all come back under the Pope and be one big happy family, But if that's what it means, to surrender our integrity, forget it.
I think they do. I think Rome for some decades, and I don't know how long, if it's only been since the 60s, since the Second Vatican Council, or maybe it goes back further, in the Uniates in their liturgy, which is Byzantine Rite, they may mention the Pope, but they don't have to use the filioque.
Right.
That's not an issue for Rome for some reason.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, the filioque, Rome has actually come to the, came to the conclusion and that the Orthodox are right about that issue. And for them, it's not an issue anymore.
Right. And also leavened versus unleavened bread is not an issue either.
No.
So.
The Uniates do use, like we do, leavened bread. It's kind of interesting what they do is they have it all pre-cut into little cubes. There's no proscomedia, there's no, they buy this bread that's all pre-cut. And that's strange. Anyway, it's nothing that we would validate ourselves. So. Anyway, so this was a time of a lot of nationalist ferment in Central Europe, and and then World War I started happening, which was a catastrophe for everybody involved, and it deeply affected Russia. It deeply affected the life of the church, and it paved the way for the Bolshevik coup. In 1915, a new archbishop was appointed and sent from Moscow, Yevdokim. And at the same time, 1915, Bishop Raphael Hawawini died. And he was replaced by Eftimios Ophaish, who had been who had been his auxiliary for the Syrian mission. Efthymius Ophice is quite a character, and you'll hear a lot more about him later on. He ultimately, as one of the books says, got irritated with all of the chaos going on, and so he decided to get married. But he didn't leave the episcopate. He stayed in the episcopate. Of course, he was cast out of the church, but he continued to ordain people. And so the Eastern style vagantes mostly come out of him. And they think, who claim that they have some kind of claim to legitimacy because they came to him. Now, what's even more interesting is that part of the context for this was that the Metropolia, or the Russian mission, tried to establish an American Orthodox Church that was not, had no ethnic affiliation, aside from that it was under the Russian Church, or at least attached to the Russian Church. But we'll go into that more. So remember Efthymius Ophice. About the same time, there was a guy named Alexander Zubai, who was a Uniate priest and who came over to the Orthodox Church, and he was consecrated as Bishop Stefan of Pittsburgh. Then, just a couple of others. In 1916, Bishop Alexander Niemolovsky was made Bishop of Canada. Philip Stavitsky made Bishop of Alaska. And in 1917, because of the development of the Great Council of 1917, Archbishop Evdokim went back to Russia, never to return. He went as a delegate to the 1917 Sabor, or council, which is one of the things we'll talk about next. However, in just 2 years, he had received 65 parishes. So the mission during this period, up from Saint Tikhon's departure in 1907 to 1917, more than doubled in number of parishes. A lot of it was return of Uniates, but there were also parishes that were established all over the country. One of these was by, I think it was probably a Uniate parish, Uniate community that became Orthodox in the middle of Oklahoma. And Father John Kachurov, who built the cathedral in Chicago, would commute twice a month from Chicago to the middle of Oklahoma to this parish, which was out in the coal fields. It was a mining area. And if you can imagine, in 1907, going to the Indian Territory, which is what Oklahoma was at the time, and to this little isolated community, that's pretty. It must have been quite a community in 1907, and during that period, to get a priest all the way from Chicago twice a month. And there were other missionaries doing, similarly, heroic things to establish the church all throughout America. Now it's interesting that in 1912, the Patriarch of Constantinople at the time was Joachim III, and he was in contact with the Russian Church, and he suggested that the Russian Church request a bishop from the Bishop of Athens to come and to be part of the Synod of the Russian Church. He suggested that the bishop be one of those who had been trained in the Russian theological education system, because many Greeks were sent to Russia to study theology, and this would have kind of completed the vision of Saint Tikhon to, with a bishop for the Greek communities, as well as Sebastian Dabovich for the Serbian communities, Raphael Hawawini, and later Eftimios Ofaish for the Syrians, and so forth. So the vision of mission now included the return of the Uniates and the consolidation of the ethnic immigrants into a united church. There was outreach that continued, especially to the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, and they in turn responded, and many sought to join. I think we talked about last time that because of that dialogue with which had been begun by Saint Tikhon, many of the Anglican churches applied to be recognized as Orthodox churches by all the various ancient patriarchates, and several of the ancient patriarchates recognized them as Orthodox and recognized their orders and validated them. Not all the Orthodox Church did, which is good, ultimately, because the Anglicans ultimately pulled back, because that, all this messing with the Orthodox was fine for the high church, but for the low church, it was unthinkable. All those Romish idols and incense and rituals and vestments and, saints and horror of horrors, the veneration of Mary, So the Anglican Church was it never achieved the potential that it had to join with Orthodoxy, and now basically it's fallen apart. The American Episcopal Church has fallen apart, which is very sad. Had they come into the communion of the Orthodox Church and orthodoxized, as it were, it probably would have preserved the Anglican Church, and they probably would have been able to enter into the full integrity of the Orthodox faith. Now, and I don't remember, did I talk about, how far did I get into the Anglican thing last week? Did we talk about Bishop Raphael Hawawini's report?
It was in your reading, your assigned reading.
Yes.
He was pretty horrified.
It was pretty horrifying. But it's the reality. And for example, I grew up in the high church Episcopalian world milieu, and I was always told as an Episcopalian that we were simply American Orthodox, English Rite Orthodox, and with a very high sacramental theology, with a very with an absolute disdain for Protestantism, you know, statues of Mary and devotions to the Mother of God and the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament and, you know, full solemn high mass and the whole 9 yards. And so actually, when I came to the East Coast and got as a bishop and got involved with the Anglicans, reaching out to them, especially the ACNA, because I was invited to give a talk at their founding conference. I had no idea that there was such a thing as Calvinists in the Anglican Church. I was shocked, actually, because on the West Coast you don't have Calvinists. You've got crazy liberals, you've got high church, and you've got broad church, but you don't have Calvinists, and you don't have evangelicals in the Anglican Church like they do out here. So it's that was eye-opening, to say the least. Anyway, but that the whole Anglican scene in North America shattered because of not only doctrinal, but also liturgical and practical diversity, which was way beyond what that church was able to deal with. So that was, you know, that was jumping ahead. Anyway, 1917 was an incredibly important year in the history of the church, not only in America, but especially in Russia. It started out in March of 1917 with the abdication of Nicholas II and the end of the monarchy. Now, they didn't know at the time that it was the real end of the monarchy, but it looked pretty much like it was the end of the Romanov dynasty, because Nicholas had abdicated to his, I think his brother, but he'd abdicated not only for himself, but for his son. Of course, his son was a hemophiliac, and they had no cure for that at that time. And what was put in place in Russia was a provisional government. Now, Russia had also been very much involved in World War I, and was not doing well at all. So vast amounts of its resources were being spent on this war. It was deadly. There were thousands of its young men were being slaughtered, and the people at home were often suffering, sometimes starving. Nicholas II was a great and holy man, but he wasn't much of a military man, and he certainly wasn't much of a war leader. And it was a catastrophe, basically. And so that whole experience with World War I prepared Russia for chaos. And another part of the reality that we're often want to gloss over is that the church was also profoundly corrupt. Was corrupt in terms of money. It was corrupt in terms of morals. It was, and you had, for example, there were stories of not only of, clergy coming to services drunk. There were clergy who were atheists and publicly supported communists. Now, the communist ideology the Marxist ideology and nihilism had been a big part, had played a big role in Russian culture since the middle of the 19th century. It had come in and was subverting certain large sections of the population. Of course, there was tremendous suffering going on as the serfs were freed, went to the cities, and all they found was poverty, isolation, and dejection. They were cut off from their churches, they were cut off from their families, and they were cut off from anything but being exploited in these early phases of industrialization. So all you need to do is read some of the writings of St. John of Kronstadt, who dealt with these masses of the poor and who had tremendous compassion on them and tried to alleviate some of their suffering. And St. John of Kronstadt, of course, was an ardent monarchist. That with Russia and the Russian army performing very poorly in the First World War contributed to this unrest at home, which paved the way for the communists to make a huge impact on the population and to stir revolutionary fervor. Now, one of the realities is that there was a huge involvement in the Bolshevik and communist and Menshevik communist movement by Jews, but certainly not all were Jews, and it's important to remember that while Lenin had a Jewish background, that he was a baptized Orthodox Christian. But much of the leadership of the Bolshevik Party were Jews, not believing Jews, but they, and in fact, these were people who had completely rejected faith, and they completely rejected God, and they wanted to completely eradicate the memory of God from the culture. This is the same philosophy that is embraced by Black Lives Matter. This is the same philosophy that is embraced by the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party. Communism, Marxist communism. 1917 also saw the calling of a great council of the church, of an all-Russian council. It had been talked about for many years. The situation of the church at that time was very difficult because starting with Peter the Great, and so-called, Peter the First is how he's referred to in monastic circles, he began the persecution of the Orthodox Church. And he not only confiscated huge amounts of land, but he essentially reduced the church to government bureaucracy. And he put all of the clergy of the church onto the military pay scale. So if you were a prosper a baker or a choir director or something, you'd be getting, some kind of salary like an enlisted soldier. If you were a deacon, you may be getting the salary of a non-commissioned officer. If you were a priest, and there were 18 ranks of priests, you'd be getting the salary of a priest, of an officer who was in one of those 18 ranks, and the bishop would be getting the salary of a general. This even included monasteries, so that the novices would get the salary of an enlisted man. You know, the Rosaphores would get the salary of an NCO. The abbots would get a salary of a, you know, and you get the idea. This was a disaster for the church. Another aspect of it was that there had been this profound renewal of monasticism and of spirituality in the Russian Orthodox Church. People would go to the great elders, they would go to the Optina elders, they would go to the elders at several of these other monasteries, but only 10% of the monasteries of Russia were renewed with this teaching, the return to the fathers, represented by the Philokalia, the Dobrotolubia in Russian, and the institution of eldership. Many of those other monasteries were basically places that you dumped grandpa, or people who were dysfunctional. And they lived out their lives on their government pensions, and, you know, and went to the services. It was the church had been corrupted by its relationship with the state and the domination of the state, with the resignation of the Tsar. The church became free to call the council and to begin to reclaim its orthodoxy, to reclaim its structure, so that they were able to not only restore the patriarchate, because one of Peter I's major moves was to abolish the office of the patriarchate, of the patriarch, and to install a lay government official as the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and to make it essentially a department of state. This synodal period, it was called, there was a synod of bishops, but they were answerable to this lay overprocurator. And some of these were better than others, but still it was an uncanonical state that the church had to put up with. And that lasted for 200 years. Another aspect of what was under discussion in the Russian Orthodox Church at this time was the whole issue of conciliarity, sobornost. Sobornost means conciliarity. It means Catholicity. It means synodality. And there's a whole history of this word sobornost in Russian philosophy. It begins in the early to mid 19th century, and then becomes a central theme later on throughout the rest of the 19th century. And as it applies to the church, there were several aspects. One, that one of which was the restoration of the patriarchate and the Holy Synod as an autonomous body from the government, reflecting the having actual authority within the church, but also involving the clergy and the laity in decision making on every level within the church. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church at the time, was probably one of the largest institutions in the world. You had a couple hundred dioceses. You had, I don't know how many thousands of parishes, a couple 100,000 parishes. If you can think about trying to manage an institution like that without modern communication, amazing, it's huge. There were the Russian Orthodox Church also reflected a huge spectrum of perspectives on the life of the church. There were very super conservative, old believer types, and there were liberal, progressive, even pro-communist types. There was a very strong group of liberal progressives, which at that time meant radical reform for the church. Not just the restoration of the patriarchate, but these issues became issues that were discussed anyway at this great council, which included as many bishops as could come, as well as clergy and lay delegates. One of the most important segments of that were the very liberal and progressive faculty of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. Of course, St. Petersburg had been the locus of the synod because it was adjacent to the imperial palace. And the heart of that, or the leader of that, was Metropolitan Anthony Krapavitsky. He's one of the most influential theologians in the Russian Orthodox Church, who had to try and balance, all these various elements, because some of the professors were pushing for things like eliminating Slavonic, translating it all into Russian, eliminating the old calendar, going to the new calendar. Then the more radical ones wanted to eliminate monasticism. They wanted to eliminate the celibate episcopate. They wanted to tear down the iconostas and pull the altar out into the center of the church. In other words, there were elements in the Russian Orthodox Church in 1917 which would have made Vatican II pale. This group of liberals eventually formed their own church, but called the Living Church, and we'll get to that, Living Church Schism. For the most part, though, a lot of the Council of 1917 was focused on reestablishing the Patriarchate and creating a context of conciliarity within the church. And these included parish councils, it included diocesan councils, and it included an all-church council, which had a relationship to the Synod of Bishops. The bishops were able to veto the decisions of a council made by, where the decisions that were made by a combination of lower clergy and laity. But, you know, of course, it was all politics. So the first agenda item that was completed was the restoration of the patriarchate. And Tikhon, in October, was elected as patriarch of Moscow. He had been the Metropolitan of Moscow. He'd had several positions since he had returned to Russia from America. But it's interesting how the election was done. There were three candidates were nominated by election from the floor of the council. The three candidates were Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky, Metropolitan Arseny, and Metropolitan Tikhon. Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky actually received a supermajority of the votes. He received 101 votes. Metropolitan Arseny received 27, and Tikhon received 23. However, what they did is they put the three names into a chalice, and an elder, a blind archimandrite, was given the task to reach into the chalice and draw out the name. So it was left to chance how the patriarch would be chosen, and it came out as Tikhon. Of course, Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky would become later on the head of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, and lead the Russians who were in the emigration in diaspora. Quite a remarkable and holy man. They also elected a new synod of bishops, who were the synod would run the day-to-day affairs of the church. So these included not only Patriarch Tikhon, but Metropolitan Vladimir of Kiev, Arseny, who had been one of the candidates, Anthony Krapovitsky, who was one of the candidates and who would eventually lead Rokor. Vladimir of Kiev became a martyr, and Arseny became a confessor of the faith. In other words, he suffered for the faith, but was not murdered for it. Metropolitans Anthony and Anastasi headed up Rokor. Metropolitan Sergius, or at that time Archbishop Sergius, who had been in North America, was part of this Synod of Bishops for 1917. And there were two others, Anatoly and Evlogi. Both Platon and Evlogi would go on and create schisms, both from Rokor as well as from the Moscow Patriarchate. So it was, but all of those bishops ended up having quite a remarkable, though not always, shall we say, salutary history. So, any questions so far?
Just one tiny little observation, if I
Yeah.
may, which is I was talking to a relative who announced to me that the Russian church is a corrupt human institution precisely because it was salaried and co-opted by by the Bolsheviks. And my answer was to try to explain about people having liturgies in houses and the martyrs, and that there was a movement to subsist apart from all of that. And I doubt whether I made any headway there, but I mean that's the correct answer to that, right?
Right. Actually, the Russian church was corrupt, but not under the Bolsheviks, but under the Tsar, under the Tsars. And actually, the Council of 1917 was about correcting that. And so, with the Bolshevik coup, the church and the state became separate institutions. Now the church was heavily dominated by the state, but the state certainly didn't pay any salaries. It just basically seized all the property of the church and killed the clergy. And co-opted and threatened others into submission. So during the Bolshevik period, during the communist period, the church was undoubtedly in horrific circumstances. Well, we're going to talk about that. But it actually was, I think you could say, in some ways it was in a better state than it was under the Tsars, because it was free and because it was not subservient to the state. Now, this is also, we have to also remember that as Americans, we have this prejudice against state churches, against state involvement in the church, whereas in many other cultures, especially in Orthodox cultures, there is no, it's unthinkable that the state and the church are not united. And in fact, the Orthodox Christian ideal, if you will remember, is the sacrament of Orthodox kingship, of monarchy, where very like the idea of the Davidic kingship of Israel, that the king, the emperor, is the sacramental presence of God in the midst of his people. That does not fly with people who are advocating democracy. And of the leaders of the church, no one advocated democracy. In fact, democracy was seen as a very radically inferior form of government. As Saint John of Kronstadt said, hell is a democracy. So
we have a foretaste now.
Yeah, well, but we have to be very aware of our own cultural presuppositions, and not project them on, a different culture, and especially 100 years ago. Yeah.
Vladika, may I, Basil here, may I offer that the founding fathers of America had a distinct horror of democracy also, and that's why they gave us a republic.
Amen. Yep. Oops. So, okay, can we move on? I'll go till about
Yes.
quarter after, if that's okay. All right. So, end of October 1917, Saint Tikhon is elected patriarch and is enthroned as patriarch. And at the same time, and that was going on in Moscow. And at the same time, the Bolshevik coup is happening in St. Petersburg. Now remember, the Bolshevik coup was not against the Tsar. The Tsar had abdicated. It was against the provisional government of Kerensky. And that government had already also been subverted by the development by the communists of Soviets. In other words, local committees which oversaw the political activity in certain areas and organized political activity, including protests and riots, and just like we have now, actually. Only they were much more powerful than anything we have now. So the council itself had already discussed a number of other elements, including translating the services into Russian, including adopting the new calendar, including various other reforms, not the radical liturgical reforms. That kind of stuff was rejected, and not the reform of clergy discipline, so far as marriage goes. Those are the ancient canons, and the council knew that they didn't have the authority to override those. But with the establishment of the patriarchate and the establishment of conciliarity within the church, with the institution of parish councils, diocesan councils, and an all-church council, which included lay and clergy. This was a very momentous time for the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, when the Bolshevik coup put so much of that on hold, and as I said, it was literally happening right at the same time, within days of each other. And so immediately the church and the state were separated, and all church property was seized by the state. All the church buildings, all the church lands, all the sacred vessels, all the treasure, everything was seized by the state. Marriage was secularized, and so all of the which was all part of the whole communist ideology of destroying the family, and the persecution began, which would eventually consume 200,000 clergy and 20 million laity. Patriarch Tikhon thus rather had his hands full with what happened right at that moment. And so one of his first acts was to anathematize all of those who had betrayed their baptismal vows and joined the communists. Uh, it was a brutal time, as he essentially watched all of these, these bishops and these clergy being shot, being imprisoned. Of course, 1917 really began the Russian Civil War, which was a brutal time between the communists and the whites, the monarchists, and of course eventually the communists prevailed. A lot of that thanks to American money. From a guy named Jacob Schiff, the grandfather of Adam. I'm sorry, memory. The German government, of course, also had funded Lenin as a way of undermining their enemy, Russia, during the First World War. And it's also very interesting that one of the aspects of the American involvement in the in this whole fiasco was that the Rockefellers were trying to persuade the Tsar to sell them the Russian oil fields and the rights to the Russian oil fields. The Tsar refused. And so Rockefeller had Jacob Schiff, who was his finance manager, send $20 million to Lenin. $20 million at that time is the equivalent of $2 billion today. So Lenin was well financed. During that time, many of the, not only was there tremendous violence and persecution of the church, there was tremendous violence and persecution of anyone who was part of the aristocracy and anyone who was part of the educated classes. Of course, the Bolshevism is all about class warfare, and of course, with Bolshevism, since really the working class is fairly complacent, there have to be the leaders who make sure that all of this happens. And of course, Lenin had stepped into that role and so forth. So you had a very well, it was a very it was an awful time in Russia. Also, many of the leaders of the American church remember Archbishop Evdokim had gone to Russia, and with him was the future Metropolitan Leonti and another major leader of the American church in his retinue. And there were other American bishops who were present at the All-Russian Council. Now, with the abdication of the Tsar in March, the funding for the American mission ceased, and it was huge, a huge aspect of the budget. And of course, with the Bolsheviks, when the Bolshevik coup happened, it completely everything ended. Any kind of Russian support for the mission in America ceased. But the American church found itself decapitated because all the leaders were in Russia. There also became many of the leaders, many of the bishops, many of the theologians, much of the aristocracy, much of the merchant class went into exile. They, some of them were able to simply leave by normal routes. Others, and there are stories of people walking literally all the way across Siberia to China. It was a horrific time. Some of those people lived here in Washington. And I've heard their stories personally. The exiles began to gather in various places. One of the first places that they gathered was in Crimea, in Stavropol, and because the white forces still held that part of Russia, and so the bishops who were among them, among whom was Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky, tried to organize the bishops into a higher church administration. Now, on November 7th of 1920, Patriarch Tikhon issued an ukaz, which is a decree, stating that all the external bishops, all the external dioceses of the Russian Orthodox Church should organize their own lives until normal communications could be reestablished with Moscow. Alas, that would not happen for a long time. There was Metropolitan Anthony had already established a synod, a group of 30 bishops who were exiles with their people. And this was confirmed by Metropolitan Tikhon, or by Patriarch Tikhon. However, a month later, they had to flee to Constantinople because the Reds were routed, or the Reds routed the White Army, and the rest of Crimea fell to the communists, and so the bishops and all of those who were with them got on the boat and went to Constantinople. There they were hosted by the Patriarchate of Constantinople, and with his blessing, began to form an institution which would become the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. It had Metropolitan Anthony presided, and they appointed Archbishop Evlogi to take care of the West European parishes. There were two successive councils of bishops in Constantinople under the blessing of the Ecumenical Patriarch. To create this body. One of the key members of this was Metropolitan Platon. As I told you, remember his name. This synod began actually to function as the higher church administration for the Russian churches outside of Russia. They made appointments, they sent bishops, they did all the normal things that an Episcopal synod does. and they were recognized, of course, by the Patriarchate of Constantinople, as well as by the Patriarchate of Serbia. In 1921, this synod moved to Serbia and were hosted and with the full blessing of the Patriarch of Serbia, and lived in Sremski, and it was located in Sremski Karlovci. And then they called in, and at that time they called another council, which was patterned after the All-Russian Council of 1917. At that council, there were 23 bishops, or 13 bishops, 23 clergy, and 67 laymen. The bishops had the right to veto the decisions of the council. The bishops meeting together had the right to veto the council, which included laymen and lower clergy, in other words. Among those present were not only Platon, but Anthony of Alaska and Alexander of North America and Stephen of Petersburg. So the bishops of the American Church were very much present in the foundation of ROCOR. The goals of the conference were to fight the disorganization of the church abroad, to fight sectarianism and the occult, to which many of the Russian emigres were succumbing, because there were all of these various kinds of missionary groups which were out after them, and to fight against communism and socialism, and to make sure that their people did not succumb to these political ideologies. This council also made a couple of decrees which would have a great effect. And those decrees included a strong endorsement not only of monarchy and the return of monarchy to Russia, but also the return of the Romanov dynasty to Russia. All the members of the council were monarchists. Now, this is very important because this political dimension plays a huge role over the next 40 years, really, in the dynamics between various parts of the Russian Church in diaspora. These decrees were not well received in many circles. Of course, in many of the emigre circles, they were received. But then there were other groups of emigres who had stayed together. And one of those groups of emigres was the theologians from the St. Petersburg Theological Academy, who had largely gone to Paris. There was another group of the very liberal and progressive churchmen who had stayed in Russia. Now, at this time, there was no enmity between the Synod of Bishops outside of Russia and Patriarch Tikhon in the Moscow Patriarchate. Everybody in the emigration understood that Patriarch Tikhon was not free to operate, and Patriarch Tikhon blessed this external synod to run the church outside of the borders of the USSR. He had his hands full with what was inside the USSR, but at this time, 1920, the Civil War was still going on, and the Bolsheviks had not consolidated power. Now, after those decrees, which took that decisively monarchist stance, on May 5th of 1922, there was an ukaz that came out allegedly from Patriarch Tikhon. Nobody believed, quite frankly, that Patriarch Tikhon wrote this ukaz, or if he had written it, it was purely under pressure, and he was given something that he was forced to sign. And his actions later denied the validity of this ukaz, but its content was devastating. He wrote that those letters of 1921 were, especially the monarchist elements, were not to be construed as the position of the church, that the administration abroad must be dissolved because it engaged in politics, that those engaged in politics, those hierarchs and clergy engaged in politics, were subject to ecclesiastical discipline. That means being defrocked. And that but then he put in that all the West European parishes would be under Metropolitan Evlogi. So this sets the stage for some of the drama that happened in the Russian church in the West, in Western Europe, over the next number of years. Now, as I said, nobody accepted that Patriarch Tikhon actually wrote that. However, Metropolitan of Logi at first rejected the ukaz like everybody else, and then he changed his mind and he went into schism. The synod did not dissolve itself as the highest church administration, but immediately reformed itself into taking the name the Temporary Synod of the Russian Church outside of Russia. And this move was sponsored by Evlogi. But what they discovered was that Evlogi was using back-channel communications with Moscow, angling for a position for himself in which he would be free to have power over the churches in Western Europe without accountability to the bishops of the synod. So this whole, the plot will thicken from there on, because because one of the elements involved was this whole collection of professors from St. Petersburg, headed by Sergius Bulgakov, and who was espousing sophiology, which is a rather interesting and very strange theological proposition. But what the situation would turn into would be this complete break of Evlogi from and the churches of Western Europe from the Russian Church abroad, or partly, or most of the churches of Europe from the Russian Church abroad, and its influence in on an ecumenical and pan-Orthodox level on the liberal side of things, if that makes sense. Does it make sense?
Can you restate that?
Okay. The church in Western Europe was put under Metropolitan of Logi in this decree by Patriarch Tikhon. Tikhon had, or Evlogi had been politicking to undermine his relationship and his accountability to the synod abroad with Moscow. Although the universal opinion of the bishops of the church abroad was that the patriarch was not free to make, was not free to operate, was not free to make decisions. But there was an element of duplicity and lies going into this on the part of Evlogi to bolster his own, in order to bolster his own position. And part of that also included the newly formed Paris Theological Institute, and which was under Sergius Bulgakov, which was espousing all sorts of rather strange doctrines. And so one of the elements, and so what this did is it actually created not only a schism within the Russian diaspora in Western Europe, there was a political element, a church political element between the traditionalists and the liberals. And the liberals were characterized by these liberal professors from this institute who had come from St. Petersburg, but who had also formed their own institute under Evlogi, and were preaching sophiology. In other words, this whole thing is a mess. And on many levels. There's the church political level, there's the secular political level, there's the liberal conservative divide, there's the monarchist anti-monarchist divide, there's the pro-communist or anti-communist and tolerate the communists divide. So this the Russian emigre community was divided in multiple ways, and which created chaos.
I think it was the Paris group that Father Seraphim Rose described as perhaps one could say suffering from theology without ascesis. Have you heard that?
Oh yeah, because I went to St. Vladimir's, which was the product of the Paris group, and I was trained by people who had been trained by them. So coming to Rokor has been an adventure.
Yeah, I'll say.
So quite an adventure, because, well, for example, there's this book here. Of course, you can't see it because it's all reversed. A History of the Russian Church Abroad and Events Leading to the American Autocephaly. This is the other side from the OCA propaganda. This is ROCOR propaganda and ROCOR's history. Unfortunately, the OCA doesn't acknowledge some of this history, doesn't even teach about it. Whereas what is presented here actually is extremely convincing as to at least a very hands-on perspective on what happened at that time, as opposed to people looking at it from either Paris or New York. You know, a lot of those theologians in particular, they weren't there in Seremsky-Karlovsky. They weren't there in Constantinople. They weren't there with the bishop, with the synod abroad. They were sitting in Paris. They were sitting in New York, and you know, getting their news. I don't know how they got news at that point, from their newspapers, I suppose.
Of course, the newspapers wouldn't have had everything, so probably there was a lot of there were a lot of agents provocateurs that would be sent by Moscow to provide disinformation and rumors and other things to set people against one another. So, was there an objective source of information? I don't know, but maybe not, that you could verify.
Yeah, well, there was that too, but there was all of these sides put out their own propaganda. So it's valuable to be able to look at it and sort through it. So anyway, so do we have any other comments or questions?
By the way, I found that description in the journal he founded with St. John of Shanghai's permission and encouragement, the Orthodox Word. In the little obituary or commemoration he wrote for one of the, he's very popular. Do you know who I'm trying to think of? One of the St. Vlad people.
Father Alexander Schmemann?
Yes, that's right. He wrote a little blurb about Father Schmemann, and when he passed away, and he mentioned this idea that it was theology without ascesis.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Of course, Schmemann was my spiritual father for a while.
Okay.
Briefly.
Right.
Before he died for a year. So so I kind of have a kind of connection, shall we say?
Well, he's very popular in the OCA. His writings.
Well, he's very popular in many places, and there are very good things about his writings, and there's some shortcomings as well. But there's the same. That's with any other author.
Right.
So. So we have to be careful when we have some of these criticisms. I knew, you know, Father Seraphim was rather prone to a rather, shall we say, polemical approach. So that has to be kept in mind.
Right. Okay.
So, anyone else?
I want to say thank you, Vladika. I didn't realize how incredibly complex everything was, but there's a lot of moving pieces to this. It was very
interesting. There's lots of moving pieces. And this is only an overview. you know. But if you think, I think it's really important to think about, you know, what were these people going through? You know, it's one thing for, you know, the experience of like the Orthodox in America, and all of a sudden, you know, everything is, you know, and the leadership overseas is thrown into chaos. All the funding stops, you know, which meant church construction stopped, which meant salaries stopped, which meant all of this stuff. And, you know, and communication wasn't that great, you know, in 1917. There was communication, but it wasn't very thorough. And so, you know, people would be hearing all sorts of things, and communication was definitely not great with the Bolshevik coup and all of the chaos of World War I going on, because remember, World War I didn't end until 1918. So I think, you know, so you look at that perspective, look at the perspective of, you know, of these bishops having, you know, one day they're, you know, the bishop of a huge diocese with hundreds of churches and, you know, huge budgets, and then a week later, they're penniless and on the street, and in danger of their lives are in danger, simply for being a bishop. Watching all of their subordinates and their priests and their friends being murdered, or, you know, the people running from the persecution, or trying to run, or not being able to run. I think it's very important to be able to put ourselves into their position, and to, you know, and because it's very easy, I think, to judge them. In the OCA, one of the things that we always, well, that was taught, actually, pretty much, was that, well, you know, who are those bishops? They ran away, you know, from their sees, and, you know, they should have stayed and fought and gotten killed, and suffered and killed, you know. And it's like, how can you judge somebody, you know, for trying to save their life, whatever their position is? I mean, and especially from a nice, cushy, safe environment. You know, so to do that is actually a grave sin. It's a very grave sin. So I think we need to be able to have compassion, and to enter into the story of what happened at that time, and to understand the kind of pressures that went into making the decisions that these people were forced to make. So, okay. So next week we'll pick up with the early 20s, and then finish and we'll talk about the martyrdom, or the martyric death of Saint Tikhon, and the aftermath of that in the Russian Church, and how that all affected America. So,
Great.
All right.
Thank you so much.
God bless you. Let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God. more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption, thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever and into ages of ages. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Vladika.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vladika.
So we'll see you all next week.
You bet.
Not before.
Be blessed.